So I think we're ready to get started. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for coming tonight. First of all, we want to thank Susan and the Craftsbury Library for hosting tonight's event. And we want to thank Hardwick Community Television for filming the event. And you can tell your friends who couldn't make it tonight that soon it'll be on HCTV or on the Galaxy tab at the HCTV website. So if anybody that you know was hoping to come and missed it, you can tell them to check it out. I'm Andrea, I'm from the Galaxy Bookshop, and I'm really excited to introduce Oswald's book tonight, In the Time of the Americans. The first book I read by Oswald was a few years ago, was The Centurion, and I had never read anything like that before, and if you haven't read that, you should check that one out. So when Oswald asked if, for his publisher, if I would be an early reader for this book, I jumped at the chance. I was very excited. I read it in a day at work. And
the sex scenes.
Twice. I read those twice at work. But my favorite kinds of books are historical fiction. I love books that have multi-generational family stories. I love books that teach me about a place and a culture and a history that I don't know. I often tell people the story of the first time I took an actual sick day from a real job when I was out of college, like first job I got that had a sick day. I took and I stayed home to read The House of Spirits by Isabel Allende. And I was kind of brought back to that a little bit when I was kind of skipping out on work and reading this book all day. It has all of those things that I love. A multi-generational family story, some beautiful love stories, some tragedies, a history of a place I don't know anything about. I do more now. A little bit of magical realism in there. All these things that are my favorite things in a book were in this book, so I'm really excited that you're here tonight to hear directly from Oswald this book. And I'm going to step aside and let you do your thing.
Andrew, thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Let me say that when Holly, in fact, I was mentioning that to others, when Holly and I first came to Craftsbury, the first two things that we discovered was the Galaxy Bookstore and, of course, the library. And the reason for that is because we're bookworms. I mean, Holly is a bigger bookworm than I. In fact, my interests are mainly historical and military. Hey, former Marine, Vietnam combat veteran, anyway, so that's it. But, so the way it happened was, welcome. When I first started the book, I began the book in New York when we lived in New York City. And this was the time that after we had met Breck, that's Breck over there, he's the one responsible for us coming. We had met him and some friends who had invited us over to a B&B in Vermont, and about 16 years ago, and we just fell in love with Vermont. So we were trying desperate to find some way that we could come and stay in Vermont. And so I was working on the book. I did the first rough draft of the book. Then when we came to Vermont and we settled here, this is where I wrote the novel, basically. Yes, as Susan can tell you, I would come in the morning, or whenever the book library was open, and I would leave in the evening. I would leave at night. So while Holly was at the Galaxy bugging the hell out of you and buying books and all that stuff, I was here writing the book, and that's the way, and that's my connection with the novel the way it is. As I told other people, me and Holly, we came to Vermont, we're not looking back, and this is where we're going to stay. I mean, it's like, this is just, it's
Well, this is where you're going to write your next book.
yeah, it's right in terms of our paradise. Welcome. Now, when I first read the book, I mean, as opposed to The Centurion, which we first spoke about, that book was rather a bit. I have a tendency of writing subversive books. I don't know why.
You're from Brooklyn.
And that book really, it was 5 years before I found a publisher. For this book, I found a publisher right away. However, I did not know at the time how timely and relevant this book would be to what is happening today in the island of Puerto Rico. Maybe some of you have gone there for vacation, some of you have heard about it, but right now the island is in a bad way. You know, what with the protests and demonstrations and so forth. And again, there's a reason for that. I'll go that into in time. Mainly, my book is based upon the stories that were told and retold throughout the generations in my family. These are stories that I got from my grandparents, my parents, my mothers, my uncles, and stories about the island in terms of the cultural confrontations and changes that the island underwent, beginning with the invasion in 1898 by the Americans and going all the way up to the present. You know, it ends in 1970. So it's the whole situation. And it focuses on two families, one American, Protestant, upright and straight, you know, and one native Puerto Rican who were more a bit lusty, let's say. Anyway, it's the interchange between these two families and how the so-called American century affects them. From 1918 until what? The fall of the Soviet Union in 1992, it was the American century. I mean, the U.S. called all the shots. The same thing happened in the Caribbean. The American century really affected the Caribbean very, very, I mean, it will never be the same. And my parents come from a town called Ponce. Ponce is like, that's okay. Ponce is over here. It's in the south, okay? Like that, you know, this is Ponce. Now, today, Ponce is the second largest city in Puerto Rico. When I go to PR, and Holly agrees with me, we love Ponce because Ponce is what, has anybody ever been to Spain, to Barcelona? No? Yeah. Ponce is what Barcelona was 10, maybe 15 years ago, before Barcelona became this, you know, I mean, industrialized. It's a town of small cobblestone streets, what was it, streetcars, that type of thing. It's got that really late Spanish colonial flavor. In fact, the only other city I can compare it to would be New Orleans. Before New Orleans had, you know, just like PR, they had all these problems. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's a very colonial style city. It's beautiful. It's still the most beautiful city there is there. Okay, now when the Americans first came, and this is the whole backstory about it. You have to know, Puerto Rico is an American territorial possession. Okay, and this came about in 1898. What happened was that by the end of the 19th century, the U.S. we were the new kid on the block, and we wanted to flex our muscles. You know, I mean, you know, Spain, Germany, Britain, Russia, they had all these colonies overseas, and you know, America started thinking, why can't we be like that? Manifest destiny, right? We went from one continent to the other. It's time that we became a world power. You know, this view was not shared by all, but it was shared by a lot of people in Congress and a lot of people who were a little bit xenophobic in their viewpoint. And so they started looking around and said, you know, how can we make a land grab and do it in a quick and easy way? Simple. Spain. From 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, you know, until, again, the early 1900s, Spain had this empire. Latin America, North America itself, they lost quite a bit of land in the, in the First War, prior to the Civil War, everything, Latin America. But by 1898, Spain was a former relic of itself. It was like an ancient, it was on its last legs. So the U.S. says, good, let's go to war. But how can we go to war? Well, we have to concoct an incident. I'm of the generation, I served in Vietnam, okay, and we went to the Vietnam War because of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, in which supposedly, what was it? I think it was 2 or 3, Breck, you know this more than I do, you're the naval historian. It was 2 or 3, I think, PT boats that attacked an American destroyer. Imagine that, 3 PT boats attacked an American destroyer. We've been attacked! We go to war. Next thing you know, massive Marines land in Da Nang, and the rest is history. Prior to that time, all we had was just like, quote, advisors. Well, by the time I got there, I was like 1969, 70, that was the height of the war. And I tell you, it was hellish. The same thing happened again in the Gulf War. Remember weapons of mass destruction? We have to go there because Saddam Hussein and most of the American public took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. And again, it was basically a crazy, unjust war, and we're still there. I mean, true. I'm a nativist. I think after 9/11, yeah, go out there and wipe out the nest of Al Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth. But why attack Iraq that had nothing to do with the war? In fact, my father had once said, this is crazy. This Gulf War is like if, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. attacked Sweden instead of Japan. Again, the same thing happened with the war, the Spanish-American War, as it came to be called. There was a battleship called the Maine. It was placed in the harbor. And the Maine came to Cuba because it wanted to, quote, protect American citizens and interests. What does that mean? Does the name the United Fruit Company come to mind?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that was it. In February of the same year, the Maine blows up. Nobody ever found out why. There was a military inquiry out of it and everything, and a naval inquiry, and it was never ascertained who was it that destroyed the Maine. Some people stated that, some military people stated that, it was a mine or a torpedo or a bomb. The Spanish Navy had no torpedoes at the time. So anyway, this became the rallying cry. Remember the Maine. Right. And it became the rallying cry. And it led to this imperial land grab. Now, not all Americans were for it. Mark Twain was a vocal critic of this war. He said that this war is it's an imperialistic land grab, and we should have no part of it. Anyway, the Hearst newspapers. Is the Hearst chain still around? Newspaper chain?
Yeah, I think it just got bought by another.
They're still around here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Boy, okay.
I don't know if they're in this area, but they exist as an
Yeah.
entity, yeah.
Okay. William Randolph Hearst beat this horse to death, and apparently it became war fever. The U.S. declared war. The war lasted 6 months. In 3 hours' time in Manila Bay, the American fleet just destroyed the Spanish fleet. And the Empire of Spain was replaced by the Empire of good Protestant ethics, good work ethics, and 10-cent cigars. Okay. What has this got to do with Ponce? When the Americans attacked, the initial target was San Juan, which is the capital. Okay. Then they attacked here in Mayagüez and San Germán, which are two cities which they thought there was a great presence. And eventually this led into the center of Puerto Rico, which at that time was mainly sugarcane plantations, which exported the great Puerto Rican export rum to everybody. Ponce was a byproduct. Someone at the well, it wasn't the Pentagon at that time, but someone at the War Department thought that there was this great military Spanish garrison in Ponce, and they would really, if the Americans came, they would there would be a bottleneck there, and they would have to get past it. So a couple of destroyers and I think a detachment, a regiment of Marines was sent to Ponce to, quote, wipe out the Spanish garrison. What they did not know was that the Spanish garrison made of conscripts from places such as Madrid, Valencia, Saratoga, Barcelona. They all had left, they all had deserted, and they all had gone to the hills to propagate kids of all shades and colors.
Yeah.
And marry and intermix into the locals. The Americans did not know that. So they invade Ponce, and at the time, Ponce was a backwater. It was a town that was mired in myth and superstition, and they had lived the same kind of indolent lifestyle. I mean, you know, for what, 400 years since the Spanish conquest, and they didn't know. Like my grandfather said, you know, the Americans, why would anybody want to invade Ponce? There was nothing there. You know? Anyway, the Americans show up. There is no garrison. There's nobody. They come in, and Ponce is divided into two sections. To this day, you got La Playa, which is like it's a slum section, the stepchild. That's where my parents come from, by the way, La Playa. That is the most colorful part of the island. And then you have the town itself with all the reigning elites. Well, they land in La Playa. They go to Ponce. The Americans take over the place, and then we're here. What do we do now?
Right.
You know? And this is how the book starts. In other words, how the Americans, how became gradual changes. How one day, Americans were told that, well, if you want to do business, you have to wear heavy woolens, even in the summer. Why? Because that's the way we do things here. That type of thing, and the cultural clashes, and eventually it was like inch by inch. There was an Americanization of the whole island, which still goes to this day, and it began with Ponce. Now, in terms of the war itself, in terms of the land grab, the imperialistic war of 1898, the U.S. got Cuba, they got the Philippines, and they got Puerto Rico. Eventually, Cuba, after 3 years, was given its independence. But on condition, the Americans called the shots. And the Americans had this base to this day, they had Guantanamo Naval Base, and the successive governments were beholden to the Americans. Eventually, the Americans installed this vicious dictator called Batista, who ruled from the 1920s until Castro came and overthrew the government. And then, he was no great flower either. I mean, let's be honest. So that what happened there. And the result of that was because when Cuba, I'm fascinated by this because I have an uncle who was a merchant seaman. He loved Cuba. And he loved it when the Americans ran the show because Cuba was run by Meyer Lansky and the mafia.
That's right.
And they had the casinos and everything, and you could have any kind of sex and right. But the mass of the people were starving to death. So eventually Cuba had its own revolution. The Philippines in 1945, actually in 48, they were given their independence from the Americans because during the war it was tacit that the Americans told them, when after Pearl Harbor, if you come on our side and you help us, eventually we will guarantee your independence after we defeat the Japanese. And the Americans kept their word. And the Philippines went independent in 1945. Haiti was another conquest. Haiti was occupied for 13 years, and then the Americans left because they just didn't have enough of it. Oh, another note. A little footnote. The independent state of Hawaii was annexed during this time as well. Hawaii fared better. I mean, Hawaii in 1960 it became a state. Okay, so the Americans are stuck with Puerto Rico in Ponce, and as my father tells me, I mean, and subsequently history gave it true. The Americans installed a succession of basically American military governors, and Puerto Rico became what is known as an unincorporated territory. That means that they have certain rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution, but not all rights. This changed in 1919 with the Jones Acts, in which Puerto Ricans were given citizenship. So Puerto Ricans are citizens of the U.S. with all rights and requirements. And the reason for that was that the U.S. was involved in the First World War, and they needed manpower. They needed soldiers. pardon my expression, get the spics in there, let them fight, let them kill, eventually they got citizenship. Okay. That was, you know, that was how it went. How it went. The last American governor was a guy named I love the name Rexford Tugwell. He came from the South. I mean, you gotta have. I mean, I love Southern names, man. You know, Buford P. Justice. You know, well, he was the last American governor. Then there was a guy called Jesus Piñero, who was the only native governor that had been assigned by the American colonial administration. Then in 45, in 48, there was an election, and the first independent Puerto Rican governor was elected by the plebiscite. His name was Luis Muñoz Marin. Now, Marin was a harbinger of things to come. His tenure, I mean, we have, I think, supposedly, right now, the presidency, what you have, it's 2-term limit, right? I think Roosevelt was the only one who went like 3 terms.
Right.
4. Yeah. Muñoz Marin ruled from 1948 till 1965. And that laid the groundwork for what we have today in Puerto Rico. In other words, in fact, recently the Puerto Rican Center Institute for Journalism made a study and found out that through all those years, from Muñoz Marin until the present, there was a multi-million-dollar network that was instituted, which was run by the elites. In other words, the people in San Juan. The Marin family, the Muñoz family, the Ferrer family. Maybe some of you, I don't know, if you're an old guy like myself, recall the great actor Jose Ferrer.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Well, he comes from the Ferrer family.
Oh.
So he came from the aristocracy.
Okay.
You know, that's how he was able to go to Princeton and become a Shakespearean actor, whatever. And they basically ran the show. So that what happened was any government aid that came in, the government aid would be distributed among them, their clients, their families, and their cronies. The people of Puerto Rico, well, you know, they can do one. And this really bothered me a lot. Like I would come and visit my father, and I would say, you know, like, you know, this government is so corrupt. I don't know, that's the way it's been. I mean, the glaring example was, I think, after I came back from Vietnam, I had to get my mind cleared, and also had a story to write about Vietnam. So I spent a year at my parents' home, and I got to know the people in the color and everything like that. And I saw this firsthand. And the most glaring incident was that my father bought this house that, you know, in Ponce, nice home, you know, and he wanted to get a telephone. So he goes to the local people, the local guys, says, you know, like, you know, it's like they have like that Con Edison, Con Ed, you know, AT&T, subsidiary thereof, and says, you know, I need a telephone. The guy says, okay, no problem. And we're waiting, and 6 months later, we're still waiting for the freaking phone. So I go to the old man and say, hey, Pops, what's with the phone business? I don't know, let me find out. Eventually, what my father did was, after 6 months, he went to town, to the Ponce, to the town where the AT&T subsidiary was, run by Puerto Ricans, not Americans, by the way. And he gave a hefty bribe to the guy who ran the show, the manager there. We had a phone the next day.
Yeah.
You know, this is the way the government ran. This is the way it was positioned, and this went on. And when I confronted my father, he would say, you know, okay, será, you know, like the song. Well, will be, you know, it's always been like that, it'll always remain like that. Well, to a certain extent, it did. The only other change was in 1952, Puerto Rico became what is known as a Commonwealth. What does that mean? That means that, again, the Americans would run the show, the locals would govern their own affairs, but the laissez-faire situation would still remain in place. You know, there was still no oversight, and this is the way to continue until Hurricane Maria. Now, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. I have friends from the Virgin Islands who always pick a fight with me and says, Puerto Rico gets all the, they get all the attention. What about us? And he's right. The Virgin Islands did suffer as much or even more in some cases. But the emphasis was on Puerto Rico because of the brewing political situation. Puerto Rico, basically, the Trump administration, I think, by their own estimates, they gave Puerto Rico in aid $11.5 billion. Okay. As opposed to in 1917 in Houston, in Texas and Florida, with Hurricane Harvey and Irma, they got $57 million. So there in itself, that was the disparity. Basically, that the Puerto Ricans got less. Not only that, they got less in terms of helicopters, in tarps, in water, in food. They were like the second stepchild. And Trump did not help the situation at all. On TV, if you watch CNN and MSNBC, he's always referring to Puerto Rico as that country. He doesn't know that we're an integral part of the American imperium, and we're part of the republic. We're citizens. But to him, that didn't work. And then he lambasted Congress for foolishly giving away $92 billion to Puerto Rico when it could have gone to Sacramento or Texas. The results, the truth was that it was only $11.2 billion that were given. And then, when the aid came because of the initial corruption, the food would basically land in San Juan and it would rot on the docks.
Yeah.
So eventually the people, what? Eventually you had no food, you had no water, the electric grid just fell apart, there was no electricity. You couldn't get medication. If you had, let's say, taking medication for cholesterol or diabetes or insulin, you couldn't get it. And people started dying in droves. I have friends in Harlem who tell me to this day, outside, their backyards became cemeteries. Because what they do is they would have to basically just inter those people there because there was nothing there. Or else people would walk down the street in the middle of the night, there was no light, and they would smell the flesh of the rotting bodies. Yeah. And that's how they knew the people died. And it was, and it was really, it was hellish and troubling. Now, Trump decided to have, he was getting bad press over here for what was happening in the mainland. So he decided to have a commission investigate how many people had died in Puerto Rico. They come up with a magic number, 67. Recently, I think the University of Washington made a study, and it was 3,257 who died. And lots of them were just basically not even, they just rotted. There was this scheme that the Trump administration had of sending what they call these refrigerated trucks, like morgues, to the countryside. Mainly, most of the deaths were here in the center. In the center of PR, that's where the main population is, and that's where all the old sugarcane factories and so forth. That's where it's insulated. And Ponce, they suffered somewhat, and so did San Juan. But Ponce and San Juan, relatively quick, they had electricity. I think after 2 months, they had electricity. Partially electric. Can you imagine being here 2 months without no electricity, no food, no water? Eventually it did. In the center of the island, some people still don't have power, they still don't have electricity. Anyway, when Trump decided to send in these refrigerated trucks, first of all, there was no electricity, so you couldn't keep them cold. So somebody said, let's go and pick up some ice. There was no ice to be had anywhere. In the interim, the people who who lived on the island would go to the local streams. They would take water from the local streams. The streams would become polluted, and that would spread more disease and more disease and more hardships for the people. While this was going on, the situation was getting worse. The American people are very complacent. The Puerto Rican people are very complacent and very compliant. But what got them really incensed was that the current governor, Ricardo Rosselló, and his cronies had a couple of meetings, and apparently somebody recorded these meetings, and it was in the Telegram apps that are used in the island just as here. And eventually, this was revealed to the public. And in these meetings, the governor, first of all, they make light of the people who died. They think of Puerto Ricans as, they're lazy, they're shiftless, like what we used to say for, blacks in the old days, that type of thing. They make very misogynistic jokes about women, and they're very homophobic in their response. In other words, they for some reason they pick on the reigning Puerto Rican pop star Ricky Martin, and because of his homosexuality, he was in print. They term him as that faggot. People who read this, what happened was, in the University of Ponce and the University of San Juan, the students got together and they formed what are known as Asambleas del Pueblo, public assemblies. And they started with it. Then they went to the local villages and the local houses and local barrios. Everybody came in, and before you knew it, masses of people demonstrated in San Juan. 2 million one time. Rosello called out the police. He did not call out the National Guard. In fact, he was advised not to. He called out the police. There were clashes between the police and protesters, tear gas, whatever. People died, and this went on for quite a while. In the meantime, Trump was back in the U.S. saying, well, see, I told you so. They can't govern themselves. I mean, they don't have the intellectual capacity like we real Americans. Eventually, Rosselló, he didn't want to go, but eventually it became so much that he resigned. So what happens then? He nominates, the Puerto Rican Constitution is almost like the American Constitution in that if the president dies, the next in power is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. That's the way it goes. The same thing happened in PR. But the Speaker of the House was just a crony of Rosselló, and he was just as, his hands were dirty. So people rebelled. They didn't want him either. So then they went to this lady whose name is Gonzalez. She's what is known as the Assistant Administrator of Puerto Rican Affairs. In other words, she represents Puerto Rico in the U.S. Congress, and she came, and the people didn't want her. More rioting and more fire in the streets, and she was toppled. So you had 3 governors in 6 days, and the situation continues. How it's going to end, we do not know.
There's nobody in power now?
Well, they've called for a special election, not a referendum, but special election within the next few months to see who the people are willing to elect. But the problem is that all the politicians are tainted, so they don't know who's going to, unless the U.S. government appoints somebody, which I don't know that would go very well with the natives. So at this point, nobody knows, So basically, my book basically, chronicles all of this until the present. However, I ended in 1970. Holly was saying that I owe my publisher another book. In fact, I owe them a cookbook for next year.
Forget the cookbook.
Holly was thinking, make it a sequel. Make it a sequel so that you can go from 1970 to the present. We'll see what happens. But anyway, this is at the time. I did not know how timely this book would be because if you want to know what's going on in the island, it's all here now. Apart from that, I mean, it's a hell of a story. If you like a book that's imbued with passion, family rivalries, war, ideological illusions, cyclical upheavals, glories and disasters, this is it. It's a great read.
What do you think of the mayor of San Juan?
She was, Ruiz, apparently it's a two-word survey. Initially she was a crony of Rosselló and the clique. However, she saw which way the wind was blowing and she became a darling of the people. Also, she took on Trump.
That's what I
Now, that's another thing. Some people are saying that what may get us out of this deal is if Puerto Rico, just like Alaska, and Hawaii becomes a state. However, that is not going to happen if ever, no time soon. For one cogent reason, the Republicans will never allow it. After the mismanagement from the Trump administration, I call him Il Duce, Il Duce's administration, most Puerto Ricans, it's become a solid Democratic base. So if they have, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, you're going to have 2 Democratic senators, and you're gonna have from 12 to 15 Democratic congressmen, and that's going to change the balance of power in the Congress, and the Republicans will never allow this to happen. As to Ms. Ruiz, she's being considered one of the people to run for the next government election, and we'll see how that, we'll see how that, how that comes in.
Yeah.
So basically, that's it.
Yeah.
Anybody else, any comments?
Will you read from part of the book?
Hmm?
Will you read from the book?
Oh, yes, I'll read from the book there, but, mainly that's, and again, we haven't seen the last of
I
it.
have a question.
Yes.
Do you see a pattern in your book for what's playing out right now? Did it happen in earlier decades?
Yes.
This kind of
It was, it was a little.
insidious corruption that
Yeah.
just has tentacles everywhere?
The famous saying by Lord Palmerston, absolute power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, Yeah, it was basic, one generation for the other. Puerto Rico, like the U.S., has two parties. The New Democratic Party, which is Democrat, and the Republicans, which call themselves the New Progressives in PR. Now, that's a laugh. But anyway, so whether it's Democrat or Republican, they had this, again, it was you'll rule next year, 2 years after. My turn will come 2 years, and I'll give you this much amount of money, and you can take over next year. I mean, that was the way it was. So yeah.
Can you speak about the media, the press? Is there an independent press at all, or?
The press in PR was very critical of what's going to happen. They've always been critical, but the people were so sanguine, they never paid any attention to it. Now they did. I mean, especially after it was the press that leaked the tapes of this, this infamous meeting that Rosselló had with his cronies, which included both Democrats and Republicans in the base. So yeah, the press has been very vocal in terms of their opposition to Rosselló, and also the opposition to Trump. I mean, I think Trump made one visit to San Juan, so always government, and then he just left as quickly as possible.
He threw
the paper towels.
Yeah,
Who
so
could forget that?
it was totally paper towels. So the press has been very true.
I have a question, and I don't know if it's really appropriate here, but I lived in New York City in the 60s, and I got to know a family pretty well that I tutored the kids in for like 4 years in Spanish Harlem, and it was clear that New York City and Puerto Rico had like a very special relationship. That there were a lot of people from Puerto Rico in New York City, and then they would go home for a while and come back. Were there other cities in America that had that kind of relationship?
It's funny, I was raised in Spanish Harlem, and my parents came to Puerto Rico, the great first influx was in the 1950s, where a lot of Puerto Ricans came, and they settled mainly in New York.
Yeah.
Because that was the closest. It was first. It was like it was the old DC-6 constellations. Remember those? And you would get there like 6-7 hours. Then when the jets came in, you could go in Puerto Rico in 1.5 hours, 2 hours. So it was like that. So
why not like Florida or you know what I mean?
No, well, that's what, because for some
Not that
reasons
they should've gone to Florida, I'm
the
just
first
curious.
Puerto Rican migrants in the 1930s that came in a boat known as the Marine Tiger, we call it the Marine Tiger, were Puerto Ricans, and they settled in New York, and they settled basically in East Harlem, and that's what became the center. However, that has changed. Spanish Harlem is no longer Spanish Harlem. Spanish Harlem is mainly now a congregation of Mexicans, Dominicans,
I haven't been
Hawaiians,
back in a
Jamaicans.
long
In other
time,
words, it's
yeah.
become, most Puerto Ricans, my father's generation, they came, they bought homes, they made family, and they had some success. What they did was, as soon as they could, they moved to where? Florida. Florida. Why? Because the climate was more, so now, in Florida, the Puerto Ricans have more or less taken over the Cubans as the main Hispanic voting bloc. And that's why I think Il Duce should be kind of nervous, because, Florida's not gonna go, it's not gonna go his way. Now, you mentioned in terms of Puerto Rico, it's funny. Right now in the US, there are 5 million Puerto Ricans. In the island, 3.1 million. And as of Hurricane Maria, according to the Office of, what was it, the Management and Budget Office of the US, after Hurricane Maria, they lost anywhere from 300,000 to 600,000 people. Now, can you imagine what would happen if New York City, if they lost, 4% of their population? Or if that happened here in Vermont, there'd be nobody left.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so that is the problem, that because of what happened right now, there's still some places where you still can't get electricity. There's still some places where people are still starving. There's still some places where you can't get air conditioning, where you have no phone service. On top of that, during the fiscal crisis in 2007, Puerto Rico suffered immensely because people had bought all these bonds, were mainly junk bonds, and then the Americans wanted the money back, and the government just about went bankrupt. So also, right now in Puerto Rico, the unemployment rate is 25%. That was the unemployment rate during the Depression, if you imagine. So if you're a young person and you have a saleable skill or some technical skill, you're not going to stay there. They're leaving in droves. So as a result, Puerto Rico is losing, it's losing
its
this new generation. Here's going. And it's becoming like Japan, a country of old people. You know, like eventually 65 will be the medium age. And I don't think people are going back there anytime soon because of what's been happening. Yes?
I was wondering the other day, backtracking a bit here, did Teddy Roosevelt ever have a presence in Puerto Rico? And if he did, what did the Puerto Ricans think of him during the war? I know he was heavily involved in Cuba.
Well, mainly he was not involved in Puerto Rico as such. He was involved in Cuba, you know, with that famous uphill charge. I remember in Vietnam, Hamburger Hill. I don't know, an uphill charge to me would be, but anyway, he had that uphill charge in San Juan Hill. That gave him his name. Now, when the war ended, he had a saying. He said, "This was a splendid little war." Okay. That being said, Roosevelt he doesn't have that bad a reputation because of two things. There are two political personages in our generations that Puerto Ricans adore. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. If you go to any home in Spanish Harlem today, if it's Puerto Ricans, what you're gonna see is one picture of Jesus Christ, blonde and blue-eyed, always right, and another picture of JFK. And that's it. So Roosevelt has been, the fact that he was the uncle of so he's basically, and he wasn't, he came to Puerto Rico once, I think in 1902. He took a view of the island and said, we have to, this government here, we have to change. And then he started formulating what is known as the Commonwealth system. So most Puerto Ricans regard him with some mild regard. It's not, he's not a favorite, but he's not in the lane of, let's say, Trump. Yeah.
It would be hard to be in that lane.
Yeah, so, that's the way it goes. How it sees. I'll think about that sequel. Now, you asked about a reading.
Yeah.
As I said before when I began my monologue here, and I hope I'm not boring you folks, but, they come to Ponce, right?
Wait,
The Americans
can't see.
Yeah,
What?
right there, the southern part of the island. There's another thing about Ponce that's really interesting. And me and Holly discovered that soon enough. That's one of the reasons we decided if we're not going to live in New York, we're not going to live in Puerto Rico.
That's true.
Whether in February, the weather in Ponce is 98 degrees and the humidity is about 300.
Yeah, pretty much.
In August, the temperature is 98 degrees and it's always hot. It's called the cauldron of the island because it's that hot. Wow. Yeah.
electricity and not.
Yeah, can you imagine people here in the set without electricity, without food, without water, having to go to local river, have the kids urinating in it, but that's the only water you have, and you can't get medication, and then on top of that, oppressive heat. Yeah, like that. The chapter I'm gonna read is, when the Americans come to Ponce, the playa, which is the stepchild of Ponce, again, the town, a town that's really very, very superstitious. And into this mix comes one of my characters, Antonio Boglione. Antonio Boglione he's not a native Puerto Rican, he's not a paisano. The word we call is paisano, like an Italian paisan. Mm-hmm. He's not a paisano, he comes from some place out there called Naples, Italy. How he lands in Ponce, nobody knows. He's destitute, doesn't have a penny to his name. There's rumors that maybe he ran afoul of the local mafia back in Italy, back in Sicily. Whatever. Anyway, he comes in and he goes throughout the town. Eventually, Ponce at that time, according to my parents, and this is true, it had two basically main people that really were like the heart of the town. The first one was Doña Saro, and she was known because she ran the local still. She had this still, and she would get fruits and coconuts and sugarcane, and she would make her own rum, home brew. My father said it was the best brew. I mean, my father was a young boy when I think his grandparents let him a little taste of it, and she had, and it was like, it wasn't the bottled and bonded stuff that you got in town or in San Juan, but it was cheap and it was good and it was what everybody drank. So everybody was a partisan of Doña Saro. Boglione ends up in Doña Saro and says, "Look, if you can help me, I just want to stay in this town. I can't go back to Italy." And Doña Saro takes pity on him and says, "Look, I'll tell you, make a deal. I need somebody, I'm getting old, I need somebody to help me with the still and managing everything. Also, more than one person has tried to steal my still and my equipment, so we need somebody here who can protect." And he says, "Oh, I can do that." So he starts working for Doña Saro. And eventually, for some reason in the town where my father lived, everybody was given a nickname. So Antonio becomes Toño, which is the diminutive of Antonio. Okay. Now, the other main person in town is the local numbers dealer, Don Juan Carlos Quiles, Quile, based upon a real person. And he ran a numbers. Puerto Rico has had a national lottery since the Spaniards. They still have it. But in most towns, there's like a local lottery where some enterprising individual will start selling numbers and give out people and make some money on the side. Now, what's interesting about Juan Quiles is that he's not, he's not a cheat. He gives you good odds and he's respected, so he's too. One day, Doña Saro needs to have a number, she calls Juan and says, "Look, I have a number for you to pick up." Juan Quiles comes to her place. Doña Saro hands him a slip with the number, and she hands him, I think, 10 cents because she wants to buy a bunch of tickets, 10 tickets, a penny apiece. And Antonio Boglione is witnessing all this, and he notices that Juan Quiles has to give Doña Saro some change. So he goes out of his pocket, and he sees this wad of bills that Juan Carlos Quiles has. And he starts dealing out them, and Antonio says, "My God, how did he make that money?" And he finds out that he made it through because he's the numbers dealer. So the next day, Antonio Boglione goes over to Juan Carlos Quiles and says, "Look, I have a proposition for you. If you hire me as an assistant and a helper, I will help you with your business. I will do all I can, and I will be loyal to you, and I can help you expand." And Juan Carlos Quiles says, "Well, you know what? Tell you what, make it worth my while. If you can raise $50 American and bring them back to me as let's say, as a down payment on this business venture, I will let you come into my business. I will teach you everything I know, and I will make you my assistant and partner. But you got to raise that $50 first."
What year was that?
What year was that?
1920, 1921.
So $50.
So it was still, it was like that, yeah. Excuse me, I gotta make my, where is it?
Oh.
Show my age, I know. Here we go.
All the time.
We just need 50 pair and we'll just put them everywhere.
And then, you know, that's it.
Yeah. In those days, $50 was a fortune. Most laborers in Ponce were fortunate if they made $1 a day. Antonio calculated that even if he robbed someone, and that included the well-to-do in town, he had to spend a year robbing people just to get the amount needed. Too much work for not enough return. And it was at Carmelo's Cafetin that providentally the idea came to him. Now, at that time in Old Island, what they had these local watering holes called cafetinas. Cafetins, it's like a coffee shop, but it wasn't a coffee shop. It was basically a makeshift structure, some were tents, where they sold rum, legal or non-legal, and they also sold the local beer. That was it. It was like think of an Irish pub, or the local bar, or the local Cheers in your neighborhood. A step below the the local Cheers. The minute he entered the cafetin, heads turned, since he was not one to frequent the watering hole. This indeed was a unique occasion, but Antonio was there to get ideas, to find out what made La Playa, that's what the Pantanco, tick, and how he could use it to his advantage. He ordered an India beer and sat at a table in the far corner, sipping quietly and thumbing his bottle of brew. By chance, 3 locals were recounting the daily gossip. "It's true," one of the locals was saying. "She went blind when she saw the ghost." "Are you sure?" another man with a scraggly beard inquired. "Yes, I swear. She's at the Hospital de Damas right now, having her eyes checked. They figure now she's as blind as a bat." Hospital de Damas is still the local hospital in Ponce, believe it or not. They call it Hospital de Damas the ladies' hospital. A third man shook his head solemnly. "That woman was crazy. She should have known better. There's a reason why the plaza is deserted after midnight and no one goes out. I heard that a man from beyond the hills dropped dead there when the headless count touched him in the plaza, and the man was there after midnight." He nodded gloomily. "Really shitty. People should know better than to tempt the fates." In the midst of the conversation, the first local noted Antonio alone in the corner. "Hey, Tonio," he called. "You here to sell Saro's rum?" Antonio shook his head. "No, I'm just here to relax. It's been a long day." "Did you hear about the lady in the plaza last night?" the scraggly beard one asked. "No, what lady?" "The one who went blind after seeing the headless count driving his carriage through the plaza." "The headless count?" "Yeah, you know, the one who has cursed this town since the Spaniards." Scraggly beard snorted indignantly. "And it's happened more than once." Antonio picked up his drink and approached the man at the other table. "What cursed?" he asked. "The curse of the headless guy," one of the locals told him. "You haven't heard about the headless count?" Scraggly beard asked, dismayed. "Yes," Antonio said, but I thought it was just rumor, old wives' tales." "This is no old wives' tale, this is fact. You mess with the headless count and you pay." At the last remark, the 3 men nodded in unison. Antonio wasn't convinced. "You believe that?" All 3 men looked at Antonio in disbelief. "You don't?" one of them asked. "No, I don't believe in ghosts," Antonio said with conviction. "My father used to say that you have more to fear from a live ghost than from a dead one." From the table, "Do you know what you're saying? Are you crazy?" "He's not crazy," came a roar from the other end of the room. "He's a man with balls who doesn't believe this bullshit about ghosts and witches and what have you." The voice was high but slurred, and it came from Manolo, considered the town drunk. He slouched back on his chair, with his shirt unbuttoned and showing tufts of gray hair on his chest. "Shut up, Manolo," someone else chimed in. "You don't know what the fuck you're talking about." "Screw you," Manolo shouted back. He waved a hand vigorously. "You're all idiots believing this crap." At this moment, an old wizened individual at a center table stood up from his chair and declared, "I have seen the headless count in his carriage, and I say he lives." If you seen the fucker, Manolo jibed, how come you're not blind? The old man clutched the rosary on his chest. I was a boy at the time, and I was wearing my mother's rosary. So you were a young boy at the plaza out at midnight? The old wizened man could not be shaken from his memory. It was at sundown when I saw him. The medals on his uniform glittered in the waning light as he sat, without a head, in the black carriage, driven by 2 black horses with blazing red eyes. And the driver, the aged ancient paws gripped by fear. Oh, that driver, a more frightening sight I have not seen in all my days. You actually believe that? Antonio said incredulously. Yes, I do. Whoever dares to look upon the headless count goes blind or worse. I won't go blind or worse, Antonio said to all. What? It was a collective chorus from everyone in the room, except for Manolo, the drunkard. Antonio sounded complacent. I won't go blind. I don't believe any of this. Carmelo, the owner of the cafeteria, had been standing quietly behind the bar, taking everything in with growing interest. And he spoke up. Do you know what you're saying, boy? Yes, I do. I don't believe in any of it. Are you willing to put your life on the line for this? The ancient challenged. Yes, Antonio answered unequivocally. Be careful of what you're saying, boy, Carmelo cautioned. You're a young fool, the aged man accused. One of the men at the table in front of Antonio came out with a suggestion. If you don't believe that the headless count exists, then I dare you to spend a night at the plaza alone. A hush gripped the room. The hot, humid air hung in the silence. Antonio knew he couldn't let this pass. I will spend a night at the plaza alone. Wait a minute, roared the drunken Manolo. This isn't right. The young man, to his credit, agrees to spend a night in the plaza and confront the headless count. He could be stupid or brave. At this point, I don't know. But it's not fair that he should do this without some compensation. Carmelo idly scratched his nose. Compensation? Yes, compensation. I said we bet on it. Whoever thinks he can do it or not, put your money where your mouth is. I accept your wager, Antonio declared. It's not my wager, said Manolo. It's all these guys here. Let them see how brave they are. I accept, the ancient announced, his voice strong. And the chorus went around the room, and so do I, and me too, count me in. Carmelo held up a palm for silence. Wait a minute. We have to do this right. I say we do it proper. Whoever wants to bet can do it, but to be fair, we have to give odds. He motioned toward Antonio. After all, this young man is putting his life on the line. Knots all around, everyone in agreement. Since it's his neck on the line, Carmelo explained, I said we give odds of 2 to 1. 2 to 1, snarled Manolo tipsily. That's bullshit. If this kid goes blind or worse, that's a tragedy. I say we put the odds at 8 to 1. Manolo clenched his fist with emphasis. And I'm putting my money, what little I've got, on the kid. Any takers? The chorus again around the room. I'll take that. I'll buy. I'll put $2 in the headless count. Make that 3. Kids, it was nice knowing you. Goodbye. Looking at a surprised Antonio, the old wizard man intoned gravely, you have sealed your doom. Now, if you want to know the rest, how Antonio and the Americans, because they get one of this, deal with the headless count, you have to buy the book. Again, thank you for coming. It was really, again, Andrea, thank you. Susan, thank you, and everybody here, and the friends, and yeah, and, you know, you'll be. I have another book coming. It's a cookbook, but again, we'll see if you. I enjoy writing cookbooks.
Keep saying forget the cook.
Cookbook, as opposed to novels, cookbooks they sell. Anybody here writing a children's book or know about children's book? That's another thing that really sells a lot. I know nothing about children. I don't understand them. They don't understand me. But that's another thing that sells in today's climate.
Is your cookbook oriented to a particular kind of cuisine?
Well, my first cookbook was Caribbean cuisine. It's called Puerto Rican Cuisine in America. My second cookbook was The Pharaoh's Feast, or Feasting with the Ancestors, which traces the history of cooking from the very beginning. The first recipe ever given was if you know in Genesis, I'm not sorry, the book where Isaac, Esau sells his birthright to Isaac for a pot of porridge. Porridge is lentils. So he starts off with that. It starts with the pot of porridge that would have been cooked by Isaac to trick his brother into giving his birthright, and goes up to the present fusion cooking or what have you, Julia Child's, whatever, and today's famous fusion cooking and everything. Yeah, I gotta say this, and I discovered really that's funny here in Vermont. I mean, I have to give a plug. If you want good home style cooking, go to the diner in Hardwick. In Hardwick.
Yeah.
Okay, that's your job. And if you want to have, like, let's say, continental cuisine, then you go to you can go to Emily's the store in Craftsbury. And every Wednesday she cooks. She makes these stuff like Vietnamese cuisine. And on Fridays, if you want really good cuisine, you can go to Christie's place in Craftsbury as well. So, I mean, right here I found out that it doesn't show. I'm an eater and a drinker. In fact, Holly says that all the fat goes between my ears.
I do not say that, but I do think it.
So that's what's great about here. You really have all this great stuff. I mean, it's really quite well. I'm told that I haven't gone to Burlington, but they say that supposedly if you really want exotic, you have to go to Burlington, right? Because Burlington is where all the exotica is and so forth. I mean, I've never eaten in Burlington, so I wouldn't know. So, I mean, that's what that's what I heard.
That's true, you haven't.
Yeah, we haven't, but it's so.
How interesting.
But I find it here.
Wow.
Anyway, thank you all. I hope I
Thank you.